All right. We are on to the B paralogism. Let's just get into it. As the proposition "I think," taken problematically, contains the form of any judgment of the understanding in general, and accompanies all categories as their vehicle, it must be clear that the inferences from it can only contain a transcendental use of the understanding. Okay, there's a lot going on there. So the proposition "I think" contains the form of any judgment. That makes sense. Kind of. This is the point he made in the A paralogisms. Like every judgment that you're making, there's an implied "I think" because it's a, yourself is making the judgment. Of the understanding in general, okay, and accompanies all categories as their vehicle. That kind of makes sense. Like there, you also need to have the "I think" in order to get to the categories, even though you need some sort of sensation to get to a category. You can't just get to them from the understanding alone. It must be clear that the inferences from it can only contain a transcendental use of the understanding. Okay. Such use excludes all admixture of experience, and hence, after what has been shown above, with respect to its achievements, we cannot entertain any favorable anticipations. We shall therefore follow it with a critical eye through all the predicaments of pure psychology, but we shall, for the sake of brevity, let their examination proceed in an uninterrupted continuity. The following general remark may at the very outset make us more attentive to this kind of syllogism. I do not know any object by merely thinking. True. But only by determining a given intuition with respect to a unity of consciousness in which all thought consists. Therefore, I do not know myself by being conscious of myself as thinking, but I know myself when I am conscious of the intuition of myself as determined with respect to the function of thought. Okay, hold on. What the fuck? I do not know any object by merely thinking, right? But only by determining a given intuition, right? So you get an intuition and you're kind of, funneling that through your understanding with respect to that unity of consciousness, the unity of the apperception, right? In which all thought consists. Therefore, I do not know myself by being conscious of myself as thinking, Descartes, but I know myself when I am conscious of the intuition of myself. Okay, you're conscious of the sensation of yourself, or like the realization of yourself, as determined with respect to the function of thought. Okay. Sure, Kant. All modes of self-consciousness in thought in general are, therefore, by themselves not yet concepts of the understanding of objects, but mere logical functions that do not give thought an object to be known, and therefore also do not give myself as an object to be known. Okay, all modes of self-consciousness in thought, in general, are by themselves not yet concepts of the understanding of objects, categories, but mere logical functions that do not give thought an object to be known. Okay. Meaning the awareness of yourself doesn't give yourself necessarily an object, like a physical object or even a non-physical object to be known. It's just kind of a concept and it's not part of the categories either. And therefore do not give myself as an object to be known. The object is not a consciousness of the determining, but only that of determinable itself, that is, of my inner intuition, insofar as its manifold can be combined in accordance. It's manifold, can be combined in accordance with the universal condition of the unity of apperception in thought. Okay. Okay. Man. It's hard to imagine a more complicated way to say that. I'm certain I'm not fully grasping exactly what they're saying, but anyway. In all judgments, I am always the determining subject of the relation which constitutes the judgment. Yes, the I think. That I who think can always be considered in thought as a subject, and as something not simply adhering to a thought like a predicate. I am always the subject. Apodictic and even identical proposition. But it does not mean that as an object I am for myself a subsistent being or substance. Okay. The latter would be saying a great deal and requires for its support data, which are not found in thought. True. And perhaps, insofar as I consider the thinking subject merely as such, requires more than I shall ever find in it. 2. That the I of apperception, and therefore the I in all thought, is a singular, which cannot be resolved into a plurality of subjects. Okay, this is kind of the second paralogism? The soul is simple. Sounds kind of similar. And therefore signifies a logically simple subject. Haha, see? I'm with you, Kant. Is something that lies already in the very concept of thought, and is consequently an analytic proposition. Interesting. So kind of the nature of definition of a thinking being implies a unity, and therefore a simplicity. So it's kind of analytic, all right? But this does not mean that a thinking I is a simple substance. This would indeed be a synthetic proposition. Right. The concept of substance always refers to intuition, which in me cannot be other than sensible, and which therefore lie completely outside the field of the understanding and its thinking, which alone is considered here when we say that the I in thought is simple. Sorry, gotta read that again. The concept of substance always refers to intuitions which, in me, cannot be other than sensible. Yeah. And which therefore lie completely outside the field of the understanding and its thinking. Right, which alone is considered here when we say that the I in thought is simple. It would indeed be strange if that which elsewhere requires so great an effort, namely to distinguish what is substance in that which is presented by intuition, and still more, whether that substance can be simple, as in the case of the parts of matter, should in our case be given to us so readily in what is really the poorest of all representations, and, so to speak, as thought by an act of revelation. Okay, I kind of get what he's going after. I did see some people saying in some videos that I watched related to the B paralogism that it is shorter and maybe maybe it's a little more confusing. like Kant sacrifices. I think he drops a couple of the examples, and frankly, I think the only example he uses is the Mendelssohn, like the only big example. So I don't think he does like the 4. But it's a lot more. As a result, it's not quite as straightforward necessarily. It's a little more confusing and theoretical, I think. At least it is so far. I agree with that. 3. The proposition of the identity of myself in all the manifold in which I am conscious is likewise contained in the concepts themselves. The proposition of the identity of myself in all the manifold of which I am conscious is likewise contained in the concepts themselves, and is therefore analytic. Okay, the manifold of which I am conscious. Okay, I'm not sure. The proposition of the identity of myself. So how I define myself. Is likewise contained in the concepts themselves. Okay. Not so sure about that, but okay. But the identity of the subject of which, in all its representations, I can become conscious, does not concern the intuition of the subject, by which it is given as object, and cannot therefore signify the identity of the person, by which is understood the consciousness of the identity of one's own substance as a thinking being, in all the changes of its state. In order to prove this identity, the mere analysis of the proposition, I think, would avail nothing. Right, related to the actual identity and substance of a being. The I think, it provides us with apparently some analytic things, like the unity and some facets of identity that are more like a priori, but not substance and subject. Rather, various synthetic judgments based on the given intuitions would be required. Okay. 4. That I distinguish my own existence as that of a thinking being from other things outside me. One of them being my body is likewise an analytic proposition. That I distinguish my own existence as a thinking being. So distinguishing yourself from things outside of you as a thinking being is analytic. For other things are things which I think as distinct from myself. Okay, like definitionally, I guess that's true. But whether such a consciousness of myself is even possible without things outside me, whereby representations are given to me, and whether I could exist merely as a thinking being without being a human being, yeah, fair, I do not know at all from that proposition. Nothing therefore is gained by the analysis of the consciousness of myself in thought. In general, nothing therefore is gained by the analysis of the consciousness of myself in thought in general, towards the knowledge of myself as an object. Okay, that kind of makes sense. So nothing is gained by the analysis of the consciousness of myself in thought. So thinking about my consciousness, I don't really gain anything because all that stuff's analytic. Like, as a consciousness, there are certain things we can determine about it, which are analytic judgments, meaning based on the definition of the consciousness and some principles about it, we can tell certain things about it, but it doesn't tell us anything as to knowledge about myself as a subject, whether I could be a thinking being outside of a human being, or whether I'm actually made of substance, stuff like that. It requires experience, presumably. And even then, those things might be limited. The logical exposition of thought in general is simply mistaken for a metaphysical determination of the object. It would be great, nay, even the only stumbling block to the whole of our critique if there were a possibility of proving a priori that all thinking beings are in themselves simple substances, and that as such, as a consequence from the same ground of proof, they carry a personality that is inseparable from them, and that they are conscious of their existence as distinct from all matter. That would be great. But that doesn't have to be the case. We can't prove that a priori. For we should thus have made a step beyond the world of sense and entered into the field of noumena. Further into this field to settle it, and as far as each of us is favored by luck, to take possession of it. The proposition, every thinking being is, as such, a simple substance, is a synthetic a priori proposition. For firstly, it goes beyond the concept on which it rests and adds to thinking in general the mode of existence. Secondly, it adds to that concept a predicate, simplicity, which cannot be given in any experience. Right. Hence, synthetic a priori propositions would not only be feasible and admissible, as we maintained, in reference to objects of possible experience, and then as principles of the possibility of this experience itself, but could be extended also to things in general and in themselves, a result that would put an end to the whole of our critique. And that would bid us to leave everything as we found it. Why? Okay, I'm not... Okay. The proposition, every thinking being is as such a simple substance, is synthetic a priori proposition. Firstly, it goes beyond the concept which it rests, and adds to thinking in general the mode of existence. Secondly, it adds the concept, a predicate, simplicity, which cannot be given in any experience. Hence, synthetic a priori propositions would not only be feasible and admissible as we maintained, in reference to objects of possible experience. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Hence, synthetic a priori propositions would not only be feasible and admissible, as we maintained, in reference to objects of possible experience, and then as principles of the possibility of this experience itself, but could be extended also to things in general and in themselves. Right, so if it is a synthetic a priori proposition based on the existence of something, it would have to apply to all things because it's before experience, and it would have to apply to things in themselves, which we know we can't know. Is that what he's saying? And certain things that we've said are beyond our capabilities. So if we were to prove this, it would kind of prove everything, and the critique would be kind of pointless. Okay, seems like a bit of a stretch. I mean, not a stretch, but I don't know. A result that would put an end to the whole of our critique, and that would bid us to leave everything as we found it. However, the danger is not so great, provided that we look more closely into the matter. In this procedure of rational psychology, there lurks a paralogism, which is exhibited by the following syllogism. That which cannot be thought otherwise than as subject does not exist otherwise than as subject. So if something can't be thought otherwise than subject, it can't exist otherwise than subject, and is therefore substance. Okay? The thinking being, considered merely as such, cannot be thought otherwise as subject. Therefore, it exists only as such a subject, that is, as substance. Okay, interesting. The major premise speaks of a being that can be thought in every respect, and therefore also as it may be given in intuition. The minor, however, speaks of it only insofar as it considers itself as subject only relative to thought and the unity of consciousness, but not at the same time with reference to the intuition whereby it is given as an object in thought. Oh my God, I don't know if it's me or if this is particularly confusing tonight, but I gotta read that again. Okay, the major premise speaks of a being that can be thought in every respect. So let's go back to the major premise. Sorry. That which cannot be thought otherwise as subject does not exist otherwise than as subject, and it's therefore a substance. So the major premise speaks of a being that can be thought in every respect, and therefore also as it may be given in intuition. Okay, so since it's thought as possible subject as thought, and if it can't be thought as a thought, then it's a substance. If it can't be thought as a subject, if it if it can't be thought otherwise than a subject, then it must be a substance. Okay. The minor, however, speaks of it only insofar as it considers itself as subject, only relative to thought in the unity of consciousness. Thinking being considered cannot be thought otherwise. Okay. But not at the same time with reference to the intuition. Okay, it's referring only to thought, whereby it is given as an object in thought. The conclusion, therefore, has been drawn fallaciously through sophism. And more especially per sophism figurae dictionis. Oh, Christ, I gotta look that up. 26, it's 20. Okay, footnote 26. Through the sophism of figure of speech. Okay. That we are perfectly right in thus resolving that famous argument into a paralogism will be clearly seen when we call to mind the general note on the systematic representation of the principles and the section on noumena. For it was proved there that the concept of a thing which can exist by itself as a subject and not as a mere predicate carries as yet no objective reality with it. For it proved there that the concept of a thing which can exist by itself as a subject and not as a mere predicate carries as yet no objective reality with it. That is, it was proved that since it is impossible for us to understand the possibility of such a mode of existence, right, like a nonsensible substance or thing or something, we cannot know whether an object belongs to this concept at all, and that the concept therefore yields no knowledge whatever. Okay. If such a concept is to indicate, under the name of substance, an object that can be given, and is thus to become knowledge, it must be made to rest on a permanent intuition as the indispensable condition, of the objective reality of a concept. So what he's saying is it's using limitations related to thought to prove something that is a substance. I think it's like the bigger point he's making. And the same rules don't apply. And frankly, we don't know anything about thoughts, let alone the fact that a thought is, and let me go back to it really quick. The fact that a thought, if something can't be thought of otherwise than a subject, it must be a substance, right? We don't know that about thoughts. Because of what he said. Thoughts are noumena, meaning they're nonsensible things, and things that exist outside of our senses we can't really know anything about. And so to base any syllogism on that concept would be something in Latin. That's bad. Something diction. Yeah, I agree. That is, as that which by alone the object is given. I gotta get a new highlighter. I'm running through highlighters like crazy, man. These highlighted, I don't know. I highlight everything. If you went through this book and were like, okay, looks like about 40 to 50% of the 600-page book is highlighted. Not sure that's helpful, but for whatever reason, I insist on doing it. Be better if I highlighted like 10, 15%. That seems actually helpful. In inner intuition, however, we have nothing permanent, for the I is only the consciousness of my thinking. And if we do not go beyond this thinking, then we are without the necessary condition for applying the concept of substance. Right? That is, of self-subsistent subject to oneself as a thinking being. Right, if we stick to like thoughts, judgments, whatever, we're not going beyond that. Even if we're thinking about ourselves, we have to go on that at some point to go to a corporeal self or a physical self or some sort of something that would be helpful for actually establishing whether or not our soul is simple, or like part of us is simpler, etc., etc. Thus, the simplicity of the substance entirely disappears, along with the objective reality of the concept, and is transformed into a merely logical qualitative unity of self-consciousness in thought in general, whether the subject be composite or not. Okay. Refutation of Mendelssohn's proof of the permanence of the soul. I think Kant was friends with Mendelssohn. The acute philosopher perceived very quickly how the ordinary argument that the soul, even if admitted to be a simple being, cannot cease to exist by decomposition, was inadequate to prove its necessary continuance, because no one can also suppose that it ceases to exist by simply vanishing. He therefore tried in his Phaedo, I kind of went, I wasn't sure if I wanted to go Phaedo or Phaedo, and then I went hard Phaedo, but there was a remnant of Phaedo in there, and I went Phaedo. Okay, anyway, to prove that the soul was not liable to that kind of perishing, which would be a true annihilation, by endeavoring to show that a simple being cannot cease to exist at all. I read that. I like Plato's Republic. I don't much care for the dialogues. Maybe it's because I'm a dullard or something, but it always feels like Plato is just doing logic tricks, and like it's so language based and definition based and stuff. It doesn't pack a lot of punch for me personally. The Republic is incredible though. Anyway. By endeavoring to show that a simple being cannot cease to exist at all. Okay. For a simple being, because it has no parts, and therefore no plurality within itself, cannot be diminished, and thus gradually lose something of its existence and be changed by little and little into nothing. Can't happen, because it's a unity. All right. And therefore, there would be no time whatever between one instance in which it is and the other in which it no longer is. And this is impossible. He did not consider, however, that although we might allow the soul this simple nature, namely, that it contains no manifold components external to one another, and therefore no extensive magnitude, yet we cannot deny to it as little as to any other existing thing intensive magnitude, i.e. a degree of reality with respect to all its faculties, nay, with respect to everything that constitutes its existence. Okay, I'm going to reread that because I choked in the middle of it and lost my train of thought. He did not consider, however, that although we might allow the soul this simple nature, namely that it contains no manifold components external to one another, and therefore no extensive magnitude, yet we cannot deny to it, as little as to any other existing thing, intensive magnitude. So we can't deny to it intensive magnitude. My follow-up would be, what the fuck is intensive magnitude? Like actual taking up space or something? Or internal magnitude? Like I don't know. I.e., a degree of reality with respect. I guess this is what a degree of reality with respect to all its faculties. Okay. Nay, with respect to everything that constitutes its existence. Such a degree of reality might diminish through an infinite number of smaller degrees. And thus, the supposed balance, the permanence of which has not yet been established, might be transformed into nothing. Not indeed by decomposition, but by gradual loss of its powers. So if it has just a degree of reality with respect to all of its faculties, even if it is kind of a singularity, it could be slowly decomposed of its powers. For even consciousness has always a degree which always admits of being diminished. And so interesting. So since consciousness can be diminished, and consciousness, you can't clean it and throw it around and stuff, which it always admits of being diminished, and so does therefore the faculty of being conscious of oneself, also interesting, which would be like a consciousness of the soul in a way, as well as all other faculties. The permanence of the soul, therefore, considered as a mere object of inner sense, remains undemonstrated, and indeed undemonstrable, although its permanence in life, in which the thinking being, as human, is at the same time to itself an object of the outer sense, is clear by itself. So we just can't know, pretty much, if it's if it's singular, simple. We've already established we can't know whether it's simple or not, but we also just can't know anything about it, and therefore we can't really know if it's gonna exist after death, blah blah blah, etc. But this does not satisfy the rational psychologist, who undertakes to prove from mere concepts the absolute permanence of the soul, even beyond his life. Now, if we take the above propositions in synthetic connection as valid for all thinking things, as indeed they must be taken, in a system of rational psychology, and proceed from the categories of relation with the proposition, all thinking beings as such are substances, backwards through the series of propositions until the circle is completed, then we arrive in the end at the existence of these thinking beings. And in this system, they are not only conscious of their existence independently of external things, but are supposed to be able to determine this existence by themselves with respect to the permanence which necessarily belongs to the character of substance. Okay? Hence it follows that in this rationalist system, idealism, at least problematic idealism, idealism is unavoidable. Let me check my chart. What's idealism again? Idealism is the thought that you can oh no, I had it backwards. Senses are insufficient to make an object certain, and all appearances are mere representations. Right, because we can't know. Okay, yeah. For if the existence of external things is not required at all for determining one's own existence in time, then their existence is only a gratuitous assumption of which no proof can ever be given. Okay, I understand. If, on the contrary, we proceed analytically, taking the I think, a proposition that already includes an existence as given, and hence also taking modality as given, and then analyzing this proposition in order to find out its content, so as to discover whether and how the I determines its existence in space and time solely through that content, then the propositions of rational psychology would not start from the concept of a thinking being in general, but from an actuality. I determines the existence in space and time solely through that content. Sorry, I gotta reread that. God, it's a whole paragraph. Okay. If, on the contrary, we proceed analytically, taking the I think, a proposition that already includes an existence. Right, the I think includes an existence as given. Can't have an I think without existing. And hence also taking modality. I don't know what he means by modality exactly, as given. Meaning like that you're a person. And then analyzing this proposition in order to find out its content, the I think, so as to discover whether and how the I determines its existence in space and time solely through that content, then the propositions of rational psychology would not start from the concept of a thinking being in general. It wouldn't. It would start from an actuality, meaning like you're starting with an individual that, okay, I get it. And we should infer from the manner in which this reality is thought, after everything that is empirical in it has been removed, what belongs to a thinking being in general. This is shown by the following table. 1. I think. 2. As subject. 3. As simple subject. 4. As identical subject in every state of my thought. I think as subject, as simple subject, as identical subject in every state of my thought. Okay. As it is not determined in the second proposition whether I can exist, proposition as subject, can exist and be thought only as a subject and not only as a predicate of something else, the concept of subject is here taken merely logically, and it remains undetermined whether or not we are to understand by it a substance. Okay, I agree. In the third proposition, however, simple subject, the absolute unity of apperception, the simple I, in the representation to which all combination or separation that constitute thought refers, has its own importance, although nothing is established as yet with regard to the constitution of the subject or its subsistence. Apperception of the unity. Okay, apperception is something real, and its simplicity is already contained in its possibility. In space, however, there is nothing real that is simple. Oh, interesting. Yeah. For points, the only simple things in space are merely limits, and not themselves something which, as a part, serves to constitute space. From this follows the impossibility of explaining the constitution of myself as merely a thinking subject in the terms of materialism. As, however, in the first proposition, my existence is taken as given, for it is not said in it that every thinking being exists. This would predicate too much of them, namely absolute necessity. But only that I exist as thinking. Therefore, the proposition itself is empirical, and contains determinability of my existence merely with regard to my representations in time. I gotta Okay. As however, in the first proposition, my existence is taken as given. For it is not said in it that every thinking being exists. This would predicate too much of them, namely absolute necessity. Right? But only that I exist as thinking. Therefore, the proposition itself is empirical, and contains determinability of my existence merely with regard to my representations in time. That makes sense. So meaning just the fact that there's a thinking being doesn't mean it exists. There's some empirical aspect of it that has to confirm its existence. But as for this purpose... God, this is so much more confusing than that fucking paralogisms. But as for this purpose, I again require, first of all, something permanent, which insofar as I think myself, is not given to me at all in inner intuition. It is quite impossible by means of this simple self-consciousness to determine the manner in which I exist, whether it be as substance or as accident. Okay, that makes sense. Thus, if materialism is inadequate to explain my existence, then spiritualism is equally insufficient for this purpose. Okay. And this conclusion is that in no way whatsoever can we know anything of the constitution of our soul as far as the possibility of its separate existence in general is concerned. Okay. You're kind of getting me. And how, indeed, should it be possible, by means of that unity of consciousness, which we only know because it is indispensable for us, to us, for the possibility of experience, to get beyond experience, our existence in life, and even extend our knowledge. And how, indeed, should it be possible, by means of that unity of consciousness, which we only know because it is indispensable to us for the possibility of experience, to get beyond experience, and even to extend our knowledge by the empirical, but, with regard to any kind of intuition, indeterminate proposition, I think, to the nature of all thinking beings in general. It seems impossible. There is, therefore, no rational psychology as a doctrine furnishing any addition to our self-knowledge, but only as a discipline fixing impassable limits to speculative reason in this field. And it fixes these limits partly to keep us from throwing ourselves into the arms of soulless materialism, and partly to keep us from losing ourselves in a vague, and with regard to practical life, baseless spiritualism. It reminds us at the same time to look upon this refusal of our reason to give a satisfactory answer to our curious questions, which reach beyond the limits of this life, as a hint from reason to turn our self-knowledge away from fruitless, extravagant speculations to a fruitful, practical reason, a use which, although directed always only to objects of experience, yet obtains its principle from a higher source, and so regulates our conduct as if our destiny reached infinitely far beyond experience, and therefore far beyond this life. We see from all this that rational psychology owes its origin to a mere misunderstanding. Okay. The unity of consciousness, on which the categories are founded, is mistaken for an intuition of the subject as object, and a category of substance is applied to it. But this unity is only a unity in thought. Oh, interesting. By which alone no object is given, and to which, I'm getting a cramp in my hand, ow, to which, therefore, the category of substance which always presupposes a given intuition, cannot be applied. Okay, that makes sense. Meaning, like, the unity of consciousness is related to consciousness. It can prove that maybe that we are conscious, or that we're a conscious being when we're aware of it, at least. But it can't be used to prove our existence and the existence of a consciousness within us, because I don't know. Kant says so. Okay. And therefore the subject cannot be known at all. Hence the subject of the categories cannot, by thinking them, obtain a concept of itself as an object of the categories. Right? It needs to experience it, but you can't experience the soul, so we're just talking about a physical thing, but it also can't establish the physical thing. I don't know. I guess it could establish you as a physical thing, so long as you're experiencing yourself. For in order to think the categories, it must presuppose its pure self-consciousness, the very thing that had to be explained, right? So we can't use it to explain the self-consciousness. In like manner, the subject in which the representation of time has its original source cannot thereby determine its own existence in time. The subject in which the representation of time has its original cannot thereby... Okay. And if this latter determination is impossible, then the former, as a determination of oneself, as of a thinking being in general, through categories, is equally so. Okay, I need to reread that. In like manner, the subject in which the representation of time has its original source cannot thereby determine its own existence in time. Yes. And if this latter determination is impossible, then the former, as a determination of oneself, as a thinking being in general, through categories, is equally so. Okay. Thus vanishes as an idle dream that knowledge which was to go beyond the limits of possible experience, and was connected, no doubt, with the highest interests of humanity, at least insofar as speculative philosophy was to supply it. Yet the severity of our critique has thus rendered to reason a not unimportant service in proving, at the same time, the impossibility of establishing anything dogmatically concerning an object of experience beyond the limits of experience. I think what Kant's going to say is, like, just because you can't prove that it doesn't, or that it does exist beyond, the soul does exist, and it does exist beyond death or whatever, eternally, you also can't prove the opposite. Can't prove that it doesn't. So, you're welcome. And thus the critique thus secures reason against all possible assertions to the contrary. Haha. This can only be done in two ways, either by proving one's proposition apodictically, or, if that is unsuccessful, by trying to discover the causes of that failure. And if these sources lie in the necessary limits of our reason, they must force every opponent to submit to exactly the same law of renunciation with respect to all claims to dogmatic assertion. Yet nothing is thereby lost for the right, nay, the necessity of assuming a future life according to the principles of the practical use of reason, which is connected with its speculative use. Sorry. Yet nothing is... I thought the sentence was going to continue. I was surprised by that period. Yet nothing is thereby lost for the right, nay, the necessity of assuming a future life according to the principles of practical use of reason, which is connected with its speculative use. Still doesn't seem like a complete sentence, but okay. For the merely speculative proof has never been able to exercise any influence on the common human reason. People are dum-dums, that's what Kant is saying. It stands so entirely on the tip of the hair that even the schools can only stop it from falling by keeping it constantly spinning around like a top. Hence, even in their own eyes, the proof yields no permanent foundation upon which anything can be built. The proofs which are serviceable for the world at large retain their value undiminished. Nay, they gain a clarity and natural force upon the surrender of those dogmatic pretensions. For they place reason in its own peculiar domain, namely, the order of ends, which is yet at the same time an order of nature. And then reason, considered as in itself a practical faculty that is not limited to the conditions of nature, is justified in expanding the order of ends, and with it our own existence, beyond the limits of experience and life. And according to the analogy with the nature of living beings in the world, in which reason must necessarily admit the principle that no organ, no faculty, no impulse, and so nothing can be found in these beings that would be either superfluous or disproportionate to its use, and hence purposeless, but that everything in them is adequate to its destination in life. According to this analogy, the human being, who alone can contain in himself the final end of all this order, would be the only creature excluded from it. For his natural dispositions, not merely his talents for the impulses to make use of these, but above all the moral law within him, goes so far beyond all the utility and advantage which he may derive from them in his life, that he is taught by the moral law to esteem, in the absence of all advantages, even of the shadowy hope of posthumous fame. Interesting. So we're worse than dogs, because dogs don't even believe like this crazy shit. At least they're just grounded in the world and, you know, going around sniffing butts and stuff. And we're thinking, you know, we need to have all these comforts and ideas and go out, you know, get out over our skis so we feel better about stuff. And so feels an inner call to render himself fit, by his conduct in this world and by the sacrifice of many advantages, to become the citizen of a better world which exists in his idea. Kant's being kind of a dick here. I like it. This powerful and incontrovertible proof remains accompanied by our constantly increasing recognition of a purposiveness. Purposiveness. I don't know how to pronounce that. Purposiveness, I guess, pervading all that we see around us, and by a contemplation of the immensity of creation. So we just think this shit because creation is crazy, and we need to. And therefore also by the consciousness of an unlimited possibility in the expansion of our knowledge, along with a desire commensurate therewith. All this remains and always will remain, although we must surrender the hope of ever being able to understand, from the merely theoretical knowledge of ourselves, the necessary continuance of our existence. Conclusion of the solution of the psychological paralogism. The dialectical illusion in rational psychology arises from our confounding an idea of reason, that of pure intelligence, with the altogether indeterminate concept of a thinking being in general. What we are doing is that we think ourselves for the sake of a possible experience, while still abstracting from all actual experience, and thence infer that we are able to become conscious of our experience even apart from experience and its empirical conditions. We're therefore confounding the possible abstraction from our own empirically determined existence with the supposed consciousness of a possible separate existence of our thinking self. Yes. And we bring ourselves to believe that we know the substantial within us as the transcendental subject. Right, so what we're doing is like we're taking existence and then we're abstracting from it and saying if we had our consciousness and existence, you know, that would work. And I don't know, I keep trying to explain stuff and then losing the thread. And then we think that we know somehow that tells us something about the transcendental subject, like this, the whatever soul is within inside us animating us, because it's conceivable that it could continue to perceive things exist outside of our physical body. But all that we have, I don't know, but all that we have in our thoughts is the unity of consciousness, on which, as the mere form of knowledge, all determination is based. The task of explaining the community of the soul with the body does not properly fall within the province of psychology, with which we are here dealing with. For that psychology... Cat. Hi, Cat. What's up, birdie? Why don't you go to sleep on that bed there? That's pretty nice. For that psychology tries to prove the personality of the soul even apart from this community after death, and therefore transcendent in the proper sense of that word. It does indeed deal with an object of experience, yet it deals with it insofar as it does deal with an object of experience, yet it deals with it only insofar as it has ceased to be an object of experience. Excuse me. According to our doctrine, however, a sufficient answer may be given to this question also. The difficulty of the task consists, as is well known, in the assumed heterogeneity of the object of inner sense, the soul, and the objects of outer senses, whereby the formal condition of intuition, with regard to the former, is only time, with regard to the latter time, and also space. Sorry, what? The difficulty in the heterogeneity of the soul and the objects of outer senses. So they're separate. Ah! Okay, cat just tried to get into my lap, fell getting into my lap, claws into the area, into my area. Really hurt. I'm fine. It's fine. Everything's fine. Glad that was caught on tape. Cat's fine too. Cat seems fine. Okay, the difficulty of that task consists, as is well known, in the assumed heterogeneity of the object of inner sense. Right, the soul and the objects of outer senses, so they're separate, whereby the formal condition of the intuition with regard to the former, meaning the inner sense, right? With regard to the latter, time and also space. Or with regard to the former, only time, and with regard to the latter, time and also space. If we consider, however, that both kinds of objects thus differ from each other, not internally, but only insofar as one externally appears to the other, and that what, as a thing in itself, underlies the appearance of matter, might perhaps not be so heterogeneous after all. If we consider, however, that both kinds of objects thus differ from each other, not internally, right, but only insofar as one externally appears to the other, and that what, as a thing in itself, underlies the appearance of matter, might perhaps not be so heterogeneous after all. Maybe everything's the same. And then this difficulty vanishes, and the only difficulty that remains is how a community of substance is possible at all. A difficulty which is not, isn't this what, what's his name? Spinoza. Sorry, I had to text my wife. A difficulty which is not the business... Oh, shit. What just happened? Did I miss a page? Community of substance possible at all. a difficulty which is not the business of psychology to solve. And which, as the reader will readily judge after what has been said in the analytic about fundamental powers and faculties, is also undoubtedly lies beyond the field of all human reason. Okay, general note on the transition from rational psychology to cosmology. The proposition I think, or I exist thinking, is an empirical proposition. Such a proposition is based on empirical intuition, and is therefore also based on the object which is thought, right? Taken as appearance. It might consequently seem as if, according to our theory, the soul is transformed altogether, even in its thinking, into appearance, and as if our consciousness itself, as merely illusion, would thus indeed refer to nothing. Wait, what? Oh. Okay, so stuff's appearances. So the I think is based on an empirical intuition. It's based and is therefore also based on the object, which is thought, taken as appearance. It might consequently seem as if, according to our theory, the soul is transformed altogether, meaning because it's a mere appearance, even in its thinking, into appearance. And, so we can't know the soul in itself, so it's a mere appearance, and what does that mean for it? And as if our consciousness itself, right, if it's only an appearance of a non-physical thing, as merely an illusion, Michael, would thus indeed refer to nothing. Interesting. I hadn't thought of that, but okay. Thought taken by itself is merely the logical function and therefore purely spontaneity in the combination of the manifold of a merely possible intuition, and does not exhibit the subject of consciousness as appearance. Okay. And this for the simple reason that it takes no account whatsoever of the mode of intuition as to whether it is sensible or intellectual. Okay, yeah. I do not buy such a thought. Right, like meaning I can think of a waffle, and I think of a waffle, and then I could see a waffle and think of a waffle, and like it's not the thoughts in, like, I don't know, myself is not inherently different based on those two things, whether it's sensible or intellectual. I do not by such thought represent myself to myself, either as I am or as I appear to myself, but I only think myself as I think any other object, that is, any object from the mode of intuition of which I abstract. Okay, just thinking of myself as an object in this situation. If thereby I represent myself as subject of thoughts or as ground of thought, then these modes of representation do not signify the categories of substance or cause. For the categories are those functions of thought, of judgment, as already applied to our sensible intuition, such intuition being of course required if I wanted to know myself. But I only wish to become conscious of myself as thinking, and as I take no account of what my own self may be in intuition, it is quite possible that I might be merely appearance to me who think. that it might it might be merely appearance to me who God, I'm going to restart this sentence. But I only wish to become conscious of myself as thinking. And as I take no account of what my own self may be in intuition, right, it is quite possible that it might be merely appearance to me who think, but not insofar as I think. Okay, I'm kind of there. So meaning like I'm going to consider myself, or take account of myself as a thinking being, and it's possible that I'm just merely an appearance of something that thinks, as opposed to, I don't know, something else. In the consciousness of myself in mere thought, I am the being itself, but of this nothing is thereby given for thought. The proposition I think, insofar as it means the same as I exist thinking, is not a mere logical function, but determines the subject, which then is at the same time an object, with respect to its existence. And it cannot take place without inner sense, correct? The intuition of which always supplies the object, not as a thing in itself, but merely as appearance. The intuition, Here, therefore, we have no longer spontaneity of thought, but also receptivity of intuition. That is, the thinking of myself is applied to the empirical intuition of the same subject. Okay. God, this is so... Oh, God, man. This is tough to follow. In this intuition, the thinking self would have to look for the conditions of using its logical functions as categories of substance. Okay, so you want, when you're considering yourself, you want to funnel yourself through the categories and as a substance, cause, etc., in order not only to designate itself through the I as an object in itself, but also to determine the mode of its existence, that is, to know itself as a noumenon. This, as we know, is impossible, agree? Because the inner empirical intuition is sensible, and supplies us only with data of appearance, which furnish nothing to the object of pure consciousness for the knowledge of its own separate existence, but can serve only for the purpose of experience. Whew, okay. Supposing, however, that we should hereafter discover, not indeed in experience, but in certain a priori established laws of pure reason concerning our existence, that is, not in merely logical rules, some ground for regarding ourselves entirely a priori, as legislating in regard to our own existence and as determining this existence, there would then be revealed a spontaneity by which our reality would be determinable without the conditions of empirical intuition. Yes? If we could a priori, establish our existence, we wouldn't have to actually, experience ourselves and consider ourselves in order to establish our existence, if we could establish it a priori, And we should then become aware that in the consciousness of our existence there is contained a priori something which may, with respect to some inner faculty, serve to determine our existence, which can be determined thoroughly only in sensible terms, with reference to an intelligible world, although, of course, one that is only thought. This, however, would not in the least benefit attempts of rational psychology. For although I should have, through this wonderful faculty which is first revealed to myself by the consciousness of the moral law, a purely intellectual principle for determining my existence, Through what predicates would this determination be made? Though none other than those which must be given to me in sensible intuition. Through. Jesus Christ. However, not for although I should through this have a wonderful faculty, which is first revealed to myself by the consciousness of the moral law, a purely intellectual principle for determining my existence, through what predicates would this determination be made? Through none other than those which must be given to me in sensible intuition. It would still require sensible intuition. Okay, and I should therefore, in rational psychology, find myself in the same situation as before, namely, requiring a sensible intuition in order to give meaning to my concepts of the understanding, such as substance, cause, etc., through which alone I can have knowledge of myself. But these intuitions can never carry me beyond the field of experience. Nevertheless, for the practical use of reason, which still concerns objects of experience, I should be justified in applying these concepts in accordance with their analogous meaning in a theoretical use of reason, to freedom and to the subject of freedom. In doing so, however, I take them only as logical functions of subject and predicate, of ground and consequence. According to these functions, all acts or effects are so determined in conformity with those laws that they can always be explained, together with the laws of nature, in accordance with the categories of substance and cause, although they arise from a totally different principle. And saying this is only meant to prevent a misunderstanding to which the doctrine of our self-intuition as appearance might easily be exposed. In what follows, we shall have occasion to make good use of it. Whew, okay. Good God, man. Just when I think I have some shit down, I felt like the aparalogism was, difficult as things go, but not insane and not like unintelligible at times. Well, maybe at times, but I don't know. I felt I got the aparalogisms pretty well, and that was tough sledding for a while there. Yeah. I just think the aparalogisms are better and appear to accomplish similar goals. Okay. But yeah, that's the B-paralogism. And now I'm at page 378. And the antinomy of pure reason. I think it's several sections. I think it's really long. I don't know exactly how long, but yeah, we'll go there next.